Millionaire mocked his waitress. Ex-wife's kindness. What happened next left him questioning everything he knew. James's sharp, mocking laugh sliced through the late afternoon hush of Linda's diner, drawing the attention of every patron in earshot. He sat, shoulders stiff, in the corner booth, a self-styled king surveying his kingdom from across chipped tabletops and neon lights. Today, his target was the same as yesterday and the day before: Sarah, the lone waitress balancing a tray of mismatched mugs and chipped plates. "I see you're still at it, Sarah," James remarked loudly, one eyebrow arched in disdain. "Feeding stray cats whenever they wander in?" He let his gaze flick toward Tommy, the young boy huddled at a table by the window, chewing quietly on a day-old bread roll. Sarah paused, eyes fluttering shut for the briefest moment before she forced them open. She'd grown used to James's offhand cruelty, but it still had the power to make her stomach twist. Not so long ago he had been her husband, a man whose business acumen and easy charm dazzled high society circles. She remembered the glimmer of pride he once wore, like armor forged from his enviable fortune. But time had chipped away at that veneer, leaving behind an emaciated shell with trembling hands. Brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, Sarah exhaled, squared her shoulders, and continued delivering coffee cups to a table of truckers. The last thing she wanted was to engage with James's derision. Yet his words hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown at her feet. Across the diner, Tommy shifted uncomfortably, his large eyes darting between Sarah and James. He was too young to grasp the complexities of adult grudges, but he recognized hostility when he saw it. A slight flush crept into his cheeks. He lowered his head as if wishing he could disappear into the cracked vinyl seat. "Don't mind him," Sarah said gently, pausing near Tommy's table once she delivered the trucker's mugs. Her voice carried a softness that belied the tension coiled in her chest. "Just eat, okay?" She placed a second bread roll in front of him, ignoring the pang in her own stomach that warned she was giving away her last bit of lunch. James coughed, a sharp, raspy sound that reverberated through the diner. His mirthless grin faltered and he pressed a monogrammed handkerchief to his mouth. The delicate fabric, once so pristine, seemed out of place against his pallid skin. A fleeting wave of concern flitted across Sarah's features before she could suppress it. For all his arrogance, there was a hollowness in James that worried her more than she cared to admit. "Sarah," he called out again, composing himself, "you think this charity actually matters?" He gestured pointedly to Tommy, who flinched. "You can't save the world one meal at a time." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Maybe not," she replied, "but it matters to him. That's enough." Before we dive into this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's free, as your support helps us create more meaningful stories for you. A hush fell over the diner as the other customers pretended not to watch, though their sideways glances betrayed their curiosity. Linda, the stout woman who owned the place, looked on from behind the counter. She could have intervened, could have told James to leave, or at least to stop harassing her staff, but she chose to trust Sarah's instincts. After all, this wasn't the first time Sarah had faced him down. James rolled his eyes, but his next retort died in his throat. A fresh series of coughs tore through him. He grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself, and in that vulnerable moment, he looked thinner, more fragile. Something resembling pity flickered across Sarah's face. She reminded herself not to care. This was a man who had once flaunted his wealth as if it were a shield, who had belittled her and left her with almost nothing. Yet compassion was a stubborn emotion, and Sarah's heart ached in spite of herself. Tommy observed it all in wide-eyed silence, his food momentarily forgotten. In the quiet that followed, the only sound was the sizzle of fries on the grill and the clatter of plates from the kitchen. Finally, Sarah turned to the boy and mustered a small smile. "Finish your meal," she repeated, though her voice trembled slightly. "And don't worry, we're fine." But were they? James might have begun this day with mockery, yet the shadow under his eyes spoke of deeper troubles. And Sarah, determined as she was to shield Tommy from cruelty, couldn't deny the storm of memories swirling in her mind. Memories of a lavish life now gone, replaced by double shifts at the diner and a quiet vow never to let a child go hungry if she could help it. A low rumble from outside signaled the arrival of the dinner rush. Semi-trucks rattled by on the highway, their headlights flaring in the fading light. Sarah seized the moment to slip behind the counter and make fresh coffee. Linda joined her, lips pressed into a thin line of concern. "You don't have to put up with that," she muttered, jerking her chin toward James's booth. "Say the word. I'll have him out in no time." Sarah shook her head. "He's unwell," she said, carefully choosing her words. She wasn't sure what exactly plagued James, but she'd seen enough subtle signs. The weight loss, the tremors, the flush that touched his skin at odd times of the day. Her intuition whispered that it was terminal, though she had no proof. "And besides, Linda, I can handle it. He used to—" She broke off, letting the unspoken truth hang. "He used to matter to me." Linda glanced over her shoulder, eyes brimming with equal measures of sympathy and exasperation. "Just be careful," she warned. "You're too kind for your own good sometimes." Sarah mustered a tight-lipped smile. "Kindness is all I have to give," she said softly, pouring hot water into the coffee pot. Steam curled up, warming her face. Meanwhile, James had recovered enough to stand. He took a few unsteady steps toward the register, his breath shallow. Digging into his pocket, he pulled out a sleek, gold-trimmed wallet and extracted a crumpled bill far too large for the coffee he'd barely sipped. He let it drop to the counter, not bothering to wait for change. Perhaps it was a gesture of contrition, or simply another way to assert power. Sarah couldn't tell. "Sarah," he said, his voice lower now, almost hesitant. "You take care of yourself." Then, without waiting for her response, he pushed open the diner door. A gust of evening wind swept in, stirring the scent of frying onions and bleaching powder. She watched him go, her pulse unsteady. A part of her wanted to chase after him, to demand answers about what exactly was happening to him. Another part cautioned her to let him leave. He'd made his bed long ago, and she had no obligation to share in his burden. Still, she couldn't escape the lingering feeling that this was only the beginning of something bigger. Turning back to check on Tommy, Sarah found the boy quietly finishing his roll. He caught her eye and offered a small, uncertain smile as if to ask, "Are you okay?" The tenderness in that look nudged her heart. Whatever mockery James hurled her way, it was overshadowed by the simple, genuine gratitude shining in this child's eyes. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Yes, she thought, this is only the start. A brush with James's contempt might have been the day's highlight so far, but she knew well that deeper truths had yet to surface. Truths about illness, regret, and second chances. A tremor of anticipation rippled through her. Tomorrow, James would likely return, and Tommy would come seeking solace in a hot meal. As for Sarah, she would stand at the crossroads between pity, resentment, and compassion, torn between her own battered heart and a stubborn desire to believe in the goodness of people. Would she persevere? Would James finally break down and admit the truth about his failing health? Could a humble act of kindness transform a soul hardened by wealth? So many questions lingered in the air, mingling with the steam from the coffee pot. Sarah didn't have the answers yet, but she knew their story was far from over, and the hardest chapters were still to come. Despite the tension that lingered like stale cigarette smoke, the rest of the evening at Linda's diner passed without incident. Sarah finished her shift in a careful rhythm, taking orders, juggling plates, and slipping Tommy an extra glass of milk before he left. The moment the boy disappeared into the dusk, her shoulders sagged in relief, and maybe a little apprehension. She couldn't stop thinking about James's hollow gaze and the tremor in his cough. Mockery notwithstanding, something was eating at him from the inside out. By the time she locked up for the night, a chill wind had rolled in, scattering loose gravel across the nearly empty lot. Sarah drew her thin sweater tighter around her frame and stepped out beneath the flickering neon sign. Dark silhouettes of trucks rumbled on the highway, their headlights briefly illuminating the cracked asphalt underfoot. A sense of loneliness, of endings and new beginnings, pressed against her heart. He said, "I should take care of myself," she recalled, hearing James's voice replay in her mind. Why would he say that? She started walking, the distant hum of engines echoing in her ears. Her small rental cottage was about a mile away, a modest place with peeling paint and a single front window that overlooked a patch of untamed weeds. Every step felt heavier tonight, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Perhaps it was the memory of James's mocking laugh or the tenderness in Tommy's smile. Perhaps it was her own exhaustion, the weight of living paycheck to paycheck, tip to tip. Halfway home, under a buzzing street lamp, she paused. She could sense someone watching her, a prickling at the nape of her neck. Heart pounding, she turned to see James's silver sedan idling just a short distance away. Its headlights were off, but the glow of the street lamp caught the shape of James's gaunt face behind the windshield. He looked almost spectral, as if caught between the realm of the living and the dead. "James?" Sarah's voice wavered, more curious than afraid. After all, she knew him, or at least she had once known him intimately, back when the lines around his eyes were from laughter instead of sickness. "Why are you following me?" The car door opened and James stepped out, tugging the lapel of his coat against the wind. Up close, she could see the faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead. "I saw you walking," he replied, his tone subdued. "Figured you might need a ride." Sarah's eyes narrowed, suspicion mingled with residual concern. "I'm fine. I walk every night." She gestured vaguely toward the diner as if to say, "This is my routine now. Get used to it." He cleared his throat, folding his arms over his chest. "Just thought I'd offer. It's cold and dark, not exactly safe." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "You lost the right to worry about my safety a long time ago, James." Silence, broken only by the hiss of the wind. He dipped his head for a moment as though acknowledging the rebuke. "I know," he managed, "but things are different now." She studied him under the street lamp, noting the pallor of his cheeks and the unsteady grip he had on his car door. What does he want? She wondered. An apology? Forgiveness? Her pride flared, yet a whisper of pity coiled through her. "Different how?" she asked softly. He exhaled, the breath escaping like a sigh of regret. He hesitated, pain flickering in his eyes. "I'm not feeling well these days, and I realize I've been harsh." His voice trembled, the admission catching in his throat. "I didn't mean—" He broke off, a violent cough shaking his frame. In that moment, Sarah felt torn between anger and compassion. Memories of him storming out of their old penthouse, spewing venom about how she was too soft, warred with the sight of a broken man struggling to breathe. He's not the same, she reminded herself. People changed, often in cruel and irreversible ways. "Do you need a doctor?" she asked. It was an instinctive question, a reflex of her nurturing side. She immediately regretted it, not wanting to open any door of closeness between them. James shook his head, swallowing. "I've seen doctors," he said, voice strained. "Specialists. The best money can buy." A note of bitterness coated his words. "Doesn't matter. There's nothing they can do?" A soft "oh" slipped from Sarah's lips before she could swallow it back. So her suspicions had been right. A terminal illness, or something close to it. The final piece of the puzzle settled into place. The reason behind his daily visits, the desperation in his eyes, and even the clumsy attempts at mocking her kindness. Possibly a twisted projection of his own fear. An uncomfortable silence fell. Cars whooshed by on the highway behind them, their headlights slicing through the darkness. Finally, Sarah forced herself to speak. "If you're trying to make amends," she said slowly, "there's a better way than lurking around like this. Be honest. Ask what you really want to ask." He looked up, eyes gleaming under the lamplight. Regret, guilt, sorrow. Emotions flickered in quick succession. "I don't know how," he admitted in a whisper. "I've never been good at this." A part of her ached, seeing him so vulnerable. Another part remembered how he dismissed her tears and pleas back when his health and fortune were at their peak. She inhaled, steeling herself. "I can't help you unless you tell me," she said. "Whatever it is." He opened his mouth, but no words came. The faint tremble in his hands returned, and he gripped the car door tighter to conceal it. "Just let me drive you home," he said at last, almost pleading. "I promise not to talk if you don't want me to." Sarah hesitated, eyes drifting toward the deserted sidewalk. It was indeed cold, and she was exhausted. "One ride," she told herself. "Then I'll figure out the rest later." Casting a final, wary glance at James's gaunt face, she nodded. "Fine." The ride was silent, broken only by the low hum of the engine. Sarah stared out the passenger window as they rumbled past dimly lit storefronts and the occasional roadside bar. It struck her how different this was from the luxurious cars they'd once shared, sleek machines that glided soundlessly through city streets. Now, the sedan's heater groaned, and the dashboard lights flickered in and out. Even James's taste in vehicles seemed to have downgraded since the divorce. Pulling up to her cottage, he let the engine idle. The headlights illuminated the peeling paint and overgrown yard. Sarah felt a flash of embarrassment, remembering that James had last seen her living in marble-floored penthouses, but she quickly pushed it away. "He has no right to judge," she reminded herself, "and I'm not ashamed of my life." "Thank you," she said quietly, reaching for the door handle. She paused when she felt his gaze on her. Turning, she met his eyes, pained, searching, almost childlike. "What is it?" He swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "I'm dying, Sarah," he said, voice cracking on her name. "And it's terrifying." She froze, her breath catching in her lungs. Part of her wanted to reach out, to place a comforting hand on his arm. Another part railed at the unfairness of it all, the years they'd lost, the cruelty he'd shown. And now this. "I'm sorry," she managed, the words inadequate. Tears welled in his eyes, something she'd never seen, not even during their worst fights. "I don't expect forgiveness," he choked. "I just didn't want you to find out from someone else." A swirl of anger, pity, and sadness churned inside her, making it impossible to speak. She settled for a small nod, her hand tightening on the door handle. "Thank you for telling me." Her voice was so soft it was almost lost in the heater's whir. He inhaled, tears threatening to spill, but he blinked them away. "You're welcome," he said, sounding strangely formal. Then, with a short, almost defeated sigh, he shifted his gaze to the steering wheel. Sarah opened the car door and stepped out. The cold air bit at her cheeks, bringing sudden clarity. "Good night, James," she murmured before quietly shutting the door behind her. She stood on the small porch, listening to the crunch of gravel under the sedan's tires as he drove away. Darkness swallowed the taillights, leaving her alone under the moon's pale glow. For several moments she simply stared into the night, grappling with the weight of his confession. He's dying. How long had he known? Why had he come back here? To her, of all people. Inside, the cottage felt emptier than usual. A single lamp on the rickety end table cast a weak circle of light, revealing peeling wallpaper and a sagging couch. She locked the door behind her, her heart pounding as if she'd just run a marathon. "I'm dying, Sarah." The words echoed in her mind. She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Anger twisted in her chest. Anger at him for reappearing, for stirring old wounds, for forcing her to feel this hollow ache of sympathy. Yet beneath that anger lay something gentler, more fragile, a vestige of the love they once shared. She didn't want to acknowledge it, but it clung to her like a ghost, reminding her that life was fleeting, that grudges had an expiration date. Outside, the wind rattled the flimsy window panes. She wondered where James would sleep tonight, if the specter of his looming mortality gave him any rest at all. Then she thought of Tommy, who had his own burdens. The world felt as though it was brimming with people in need, some starving, some sick, some lonely. And here she was, with barely enough for herself, yet giving pieces of her heart away without thinking twice. Maybe that's who I am, she realized, tears stinging her eyes, and maybe that's okay. For now, she decided she would let exhaustion cradle her to sleep. The questions still lingered: how James's final days would play out, what role she might be forced to play, and whether their mutual pain could somehow be transformed into something meaningful. But she would face those in the morning, when the diner beckoned her back into its fluorescent-lit realm of coffee refills and comforting diner fare. In the hush of her dark living room, Sarah murmured a single prayer, not for wealth or security, but for the strength to face whatever came next. Because if there was one truth she clung to, it was that acts of kindness, no matter how small, often illuminated the darkest roads. Morning light crept through the crooked blinds of Sarah's cottage, painting slender stripes across the cluttered living room. She stirred on the lumpy couch where she'd fallen asleep, her body aching as if she'd never truly rested. The weight of James's confession still pressed on her mind. "I'm dying, Sarah." The echo of those words brought a flutter of panic to her chest, a reminder that life could shatter without warning. She slid off the couch, shivering as her bare feet touched the cold floor. A quick shower and a mug of instant coffee later, she stepped outside, locking the door behind her with a soft click. The crisp morning air prickled her skin, and she inhaled deeply, forcing a semblance of calm. One day at a time, she told herself. That was the mantra she'd relied on since her divorce, and it would have to do for now. The walk to Linda's diner felt longer than usual, as if each step took her deeper into uncharted territory. She wasn't just returning to work. She was returning to the place where old wounds tangled with new responsibilities. Her thoughts ping-ponged between James's gaunt face and Tommy's timid smile. What if James shows up again today, she wondered, anxiety coiling in her gut. She didn't know if she was ready to deal with another confrontation, or, worse, an attempt at reconciliation. By the time she reached the diner, the neon sign sputtering overhead, the parking lot was already dotted with early patrons' vehicles. She pushed open the glass door, bracing for the warmth and clang of the breakfast rush. As the familiar scent of bacon and coffee swirled around her, she spotted Linda balancing a tray laden with toast and jam. "Mornin', hun," Linda greeted, setting the tray on the counter with a grunt. She cast a knowing look at Sarah. "You all right? You look like you barely slept." Sarah managed a weary smile. "Didn't sleep great," she admitted, shrugging off her coat. "But I'll manage." She wished she had the energy to say more, but the moment the door clanged shut behind her, she could almost feel the wave of customers waiting for their orders. There was no time to indulge in heart-to-hearts, especially not with Linda's laser-like attention to efficiency. Without missing a beat, Sarah tied on her apron and got to work. For the next few hours, the diner buzzed with life. Waitresses zipped between tables, coffee cups clinked against saucers, and spatulas sizzled on the griddle. Sarah lost herself in the comfortable rush of routine. Muscle memory guided her through each order: scrambled eggs, side of bacon, coffee black, coffee with sugar. The blur of activity was a small mercy, giving her scant room to dwell on James's revelation. She'd almost managed to push him from her mind when she saw Tommy slip in through the entrance, clutching his frayed backpack. He paused by the door, scanning the booths until he found her. The relief in his eyes was instant, and it tugged at her heart. She beckoned him closer, and he slipped into a small table near the window, the same one he always chose. "Morning, Tommy," Sarah greeted softly, placing a fresh glass of milk in front of him. The boy gave a shy nod, sinking into the seat as though it were a shelter from the world. In the daylight, she noticed the weariness etched into his features. He had the kind of tired eyes a child should never have. "Hungry?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, ma'am." Then he hesitated, as if torn between politeness and desperation. "But I don't have enough to—" Sarah shook her head gently, cutting him off. "Don't worry." She offered a reassuring smile. "We'll figure it out." She tried to keep her tone light, to hide her frustration that someone so young should have to worry about basic survival. "If I can help, I will." As she headed back to the kitchen to grab a plate of scrambled eggs, her pulse quickened. Would James show up soon? The breakfast rush was nearly over, and it was around this time he often made his entrance, like clockwork, dressed in an impeccable suit that no longer fit right. She almost hated herself for looking over her shoulder every few minutes, half dreading and half anticipating his arrival. Yet the minutes ticked by, and he didn't appear. No mocking voice cut through the diner, no derisive laughter. Her chest felt strangely tight. Was this relief or disappointment? She couldn't decide. "He's probably just sick," a voice in her mind whispered. Maybe too sick to come. The possibility hammered at her heart. Carrying a plate of scrambled eggs and buttered toast, she returned to Tommy, setting it down gently. "Eat up," she said, giving him a small smile. He mumbled his thanks, digging in as though he were afraid it might vanish. Her gaze flicked to the door one last time, but it remained stubbornly closed. James is nowhere to be found. By mid-afternoon, the diner slowed to a trickle of late lunch patrons. Linda started prepping for the evening menu while Sarah wiped down tables and refilled sugar dispensers. Occasionally, she'd catch snippets of local gossip from the regulars. Someone's daughter got engaged, another person had a run-in with a moose on the highway. Mundane, comforting chatter, yet her mind kept drifting back to James. She nearly jumped when her phone vibrated in her apron pocket. It was rare for anyone to text her these days. Fishing it out, she saw a message from an unknown number. "Sarah, it's James. I'm not well today. Don't want you to worry." There was a pause before another text arrived. "I'm sorry about everything." She inhaled sharply, her chest tightening. She hadn't even known he still had her number. The apology made her heartbeat stutter. How many times had she yearned to hear those words during their marriage, only to have them lost in the whirlwind of his ambition and her loneliness? "Sarah," Linda's voice jolted her back to reality. "You all right, hon? You look like you've seen a ghost." Quickly, Sarah slid her phone away. "I'm fine," she managed, forcing a smile, but she couldn't escape the knot of concern lodged in her throat. He's apologizing now? Why? Because he's dying, or because he truly regrets the way he treated me? The rest of her shift passed in a haze, and by the time she hung up her apron for the evening, the sky outside had turned a bruised purple. Linda gave her a pointed look, equal parts motherly concern and respect for privacy. "You take care," she said simply. "If you need time off, you know I'll handle it." Sarah squeezed Linda's hand in thanks, then stepped out into the cooling air. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the diner parking lot. She glanced around, almost expecting to see James's sedan lurking there. But the asphalt was empty, save for her own reflection in a puddle of oil. A pang of unease tugged at her. She remembered his text. "I'm not well. Don't want you to worry." Too late for that, she thought grimly, hugging her arms around herself. On a sudden impulse, she pulled out her phone again. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Should she reply? Should she call and check on him? The rational part of her mind screamed caution. "You're walking back into old territory, Sarah. Don't get hurt again." But compassion was stubborn, beating in her chest with every passing second. She settled on a short text. "I hope you're resting. Let me know if you need anything." It was more than she intended to give, and yet it felt pitifully inadequate. With a quick tap, she sent it, her heart hammering in her ribcage. The walk home felt haunted by the memory of James's confession. Each footstep echoed a question. What next? Was kindness enough to bridge the years of anger and distance? Or would his illness overshadow everything else? She recalled Tommy's fragile smile as he ate his eggs, a child quietly battling life's cruelties. At least I can offer him a meal, she reasoned. But what could she offer James, who was beyond the help of any doctor's cure? The answer was as elusive as the swirling dusk around her. By the time she reached her cottage, an ache spread through her temples. She stepped inside, flipping the light switch, and was greeted by a hollow silence. Sarah locked the door, her heart pounding like a drum. "He's dying," she reminded herself. "And I'm—" What? An ex-wife he once scorned? She slumped onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Questions buzzed in her mind like trapped hornets. Could she really help him? Should she even try? A flicker of memory flashed. James in the driver's seat, eyes brimming with tears. He had been so proud, so certain money could solve anything. Now it couldn't solve this. At length, she let fatigue drag her under. The glow of the single lamp wavered on the walls, and her last thought before sleep claimed her was that tomorrow might bring more answers, or more heartbreak, or both. That night, Sarah slept fitfully, drifting in and out of shallow dreams where James appeared, silent and pale, only to fade into the darkness as she reached for him. By morning, her nerves were as frayed as the edge of her worn quilt. "Focus on what you can control," she told herself as she dressed in the half-light of dawn. For the last few years, that simple mantra had carried her through lean times, heartbreak, and disillusionment. When she arrived at Linda's diner, the sun was barely up. The neon sign flickered, struggling to remain relevant against the early rays of daylight. Inside, the kitchen hissed with the beginnings of breakfast prep. Bacon, eggs, biscuits warming in the oven. Normally, this bustle comforted her, reminding her that life moved steadily forward. But today, each clatter felt jarring, as though her senses were tuned to a higher frequency of unease. She busied herself with mundane tasks, setting out silverware, wiping down the counter, double-checking the coffee maker. An hour later, the first wave of customers drifted in. Bleary-eyed travelers, local farmers in mud-caked boots, and a pair of retired neighbors who regularly bickered over crossword puzzles at a corner table. Sarah fell into the routine with practiced efficiency, forcing a polite smile whenever someone glanced her way. Halfway through pouring a fresh pot of coffee for the retirees, she spotted movement by the front window. Tommy stood outside, peering through the glass with a timid expression. He clutched his backpack straps, as if seeking courage to come in. She waved him closer, and he slipped in, head bowed to avoid the curious stares of a few patrons. "Mornin', Tommy," she said, her voice low and warm. She set the coffee pot aside and guided him to his usual booth. His cheeks were flushed from the cool air, and his hair stuck up in uneven tufts, as if he'd tried to comb it but given up halfway. "Hey, Miss Sarah," he said quietly, a hint of relief coloring his voice. Despite his shyness, he seemed more at ease here than anywhere else. The diner had become a sanctuary for him, a place where a hot meal was guaranteed and scornful looks were minimal. "You want your usual?" she asked. "Scrambled eggs, toast, and maybe a side of fruit if they had any fresh that day." He nodded, eyes lighting up. Then, fiddling with the zipper on his backpack, he added, If it's okay. I promise to help clean up after if you need. I can wipe tables." A wave of tenderness swept through her. He shouldn't have to bargain for a meal, but she simply smiled and touched his shoulder. "We'll manage just fine. You enjoy your breakfast. Promise me you'll eat until you're full." He swallowed, a flicker of gratitude brightening his eyes. "Yes, ma'am." She hurried off to the kitchen where Linda was cracking eggs into a large mixing bowl. "That boy here again?" Linda asked, not unkindly. Sarah gave a faint nod. He's hungry, as usual." Then, more softly, he offered to help clean in exchange for food. Linda's eyebrows knit together and she shook her head. "Poor kid. Go on and get him what he needs. I'll look the other way on the tab." Sarah managed a thankful smile, remembering again why she'd stayed in this job despite the meager pay. Linda understood the importance of small acts of compassion. She plated a generous helping of eggs, a slice of toast, and a handful of the last fresh strawberries they had. Balancing the plate on her palm, she returned to Tommy, only to find him anxiously glancing at the door as though expecting someone to burst in. "Here you go," she said, setting the plate down. "Eat slow, okay? Your stomach might need time to catch up." He nodded, eyes roving over the food. "Thank you," he whispered, voice full of relief and embarrassment. She offered a soft smile, then turned away before he could see the flicker of worry in her own eyes. For she realized she was doing the same thing, glancing at the door, half expecting James to appear in his usual insulting glory. But the day wore on, and he never came. By mid-afternoon, Sarah's nerves were coiled. Between orders, she wiped down tables and bussed dishes, trying to keep her mind off James. The memory of him from 2 nights ago, frail and trembling, gnawed at her. Is he too sick to even leave the house now? She hated how much she worried about him. Finally, her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. Heart pounding, she slipped outside, ignoring the curious look from Linda. The screen showed an unknown number, presumably James's. She pressed answer. A harsh coughing fit blasted her ear before he could speak. At last, his voice came through, ragged and strained. "Sarah, I'm not doing well." His breath rasped, each inhale seeming to scrape his lungs. "I'm sorry I haven't been by." She closed her eyes, relief and dread mixing in equal measure. "James, maybe you should be in a hospital," she said gently. "You sound terrible." A weak chuckle coughed out of him. "I've been. They sent me home with meds that barely help. No point." His voice trailed off. She pressed a hand against the brick wall for support, the rough surface grounding her. "You shouldn't be alone," she said. "Do you have anyone there with you?" Silence, broken by shallow breathing. Then, "No," he admitted. "I can't ask my old friends. They only cared about me when I was healthy and rich." A pang of guilt and pity stung Sarah's chest. "Where are you staying?" she found herself asking, heart pounding. "At the penthouse?" "Yes," he said after a pause. "I never left." She inhaled deeply, memories of that luxurious empty space flooding her mind. "James," she said, tone steady despite her internal turmoil, "I can't promise much, but I could come by." "You sound like you could use help." She felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger for the past, compassion for the present. He started to speak but coughed again. "Thank you," he managed weakly. Yes, please." She swallowed. "I'll come after my shift, all right? Just hang in there." He murmured something akin to gratitude and hung up, leaving her standing in the alley behind the diner with the phone pressed to her ear. The cool air chilled her skin, but inside she was burning with anxiety. "I'm going back there," she thought, "to that life I swore I left behind." Yet how could she not? Linda poked her head out the back door. "Sarah, you good?" Sarah pocketed her phone and nodded tightly, forcing a half smile. "Yeah," she said. "Just dealing with something. I'll be fine." She plunged back into the diner's warmth, pushing through the rest of her shift on autopilot. She served weary travelers and bickering couples, poured coffee, and smiled through small talk. Yet her mind was already miles away, imagining James alone in that cavernous penthouse, frail and afraid. When the clock hit the end of her shift, she untied her apron, waved goodbye to Linda, and stepped out into a twilight sky streaked with oranges and purples. Her heart pounded all the way to the curb, where she flagged down a taxi. She recited the old address, words she thought she'd never say again. Sarah's heart pounded as she stepped out of the elevator onto the 20th floor of the building she once called home. Bright, polished floors reflected the harsh light from above, and tasteful artwork lined the hallway in an austere display of wealth. Everything looked almost the same as it did when she'd lived here, yet it felt utterly foreign. She paused before the towering mahogany door etched with a brass 20B, trying to calm her jittering nerves. What am I even doing here? The question rattled in her mind. A part of her wanted to run back to the elevator, escape to the comforting hum of Linda's diner and the simple joys of serving breakfast to hungry travelers. But she forced herself to knock, 3 quick raps that echoed in the silent corridor. No answer. She knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Pressing her ear to the door, she heard a faint shuffle, followed by a rasping cough. Relief and dread mingled in her chest. James was inside, but clearly struggling. "James," she called softly, her palm flat against the cool wood. "It's Sarah. Can you open up?" A beat of silence. Then, at last, the door unlocked with a slow click. It swung open just enough to reveal James's gaunt figure, leaning against the frame for support. He wore rumpled pajamas beneath a hastily donned robe, his hair disheveled, face slick with perspiration. He blinked at her, eyes rimmed in red. "Sarah," he croaked, voice hoarse. His gaze flickered with something between embarrassment and relief. I wasn't expecting you." She drew a breath. The smell of stale air and medication drifted out from the penthouse behind him. "You didn't answer my calls or texts," she said gently. "I was worried." He offered a weak, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry," he managed, voice wavering. "I had a bad spell. Could barely get out of bed." Her heart clenched. She could see the raw fear etched into his features, the once proud angles of his face now sharpened by illness. Without waiting for permission, she slid past him into the entryway. The penthouse was dimly lit and eerily silent. Dust motes floated in the narrow beams of light that escaped around the drawn curtains. "James, you can't stay alone like this," she admonished softly. "Even if I have every reason to hate you," she thought, "I can't turn a blind eye to your suffering." She motioned for him to sit down on a leather armchair. "Here, let me help you." He slumped into the chair, breath rasping in his chest. She winced at how skeletal he looked beneath the robe, a far cry from the confident, impeccably dressed man she once knew. "I'll get you some water," she said, scanning the penthouse. "Everything is exactly as I left it, only emptier." She found the kitchen cluttered with pill bottles and half-finished glasses of orange juice. Filling a fresh glass with cold water, she returned to James, who accepted it with trembling hands. "Thank you," he managed, taking a shaky sip. His eyelids fluttered, exhaustion evident. I didn't mean to shut you out," he mumbled, setting the glass down. I don't know how to face this." Sarah lowered herself to the coffee table across from him, ignoring the discomfort of the polished wood digging into her thighs. "You shouldn't do it alone," she replied, her voice tight with emotion. She thought of the bruised pride and anger that had fueled their separation. Still, she couldn't deny the need in front of her. For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the penthouse's HVAC system underscored the silence. At length, James broke it with a raw whisper. "I've got months left. Maybe less." The words struck Sarah like a blow to the chest, even though she'd suspected as much. She swallowed, her throat tight. "I'm sorry," she said softly, wanting to offer more but not sure how. He closed his eyes, thin lines of tears forming. "I was cruel to you, Sarah. I thought money, success, that was all that mattered. I threw away everything we had. And now, look at me." A bitter laugh caught in his throat. "All those millions can't buy more time." She reached out, placing her hand gently atop his. "James," she said, fighting back her own tears, "I don't know what to say. But you're not alone. Not if you don't want to be." Her mind darted to memories of their early days, back when they were young and in love, ignorant of how wealth and ambition might erode the foundations of a marriage. He squeezed her hand weakly. "I see the way you care for that boy at the diner, Tommy," he murmured. "The way you give him part of your lunch when he's still hungry." His eyes glistened. "That's real wealth, Sarah, not the checks I write or the deals I close." A knot of emotion lodged in her throat. She thought of Tommy's wide eyes and how James had once mocked her for her kindness. Now he finally understood. "It's not too late to do something good," she managed after a moment. "Even now." He nodded slowly, blinking away tears. "I want to," he whispered. I have money still, and maybe I can leave something that helps. Tommy, or whoever else needs—" He broke off, coughing again. Sarah pressed a tissue into his hand. A swirl of sorrow and relief coursed through her. "At last, he wants to make amends." "You can," she said, voice quivering with sympathy. "You can do something meaningful with the time you have left." They sat there, time slipping quietly by. No grand forgiveness was uttered. No sweeping apologies beyond the words he'd already struggled to say. And in that understated moment, Sarah realized that this might be as close to closure as they would ever come. Two people, once bound by marriage, now connected by a final chance at humanity. In the weeks that followed, James made arrangements. A trust fund for Tommy's education, generous donations to local shelters, and an unspoken apology to Sarah etched in every good deed. He continued his daily visits to the diner, no longer to mock but to watch with teary admiration as Sarah quietly fed those in need. His once acerbic tongue fell silent. In its place, a poignant gratitude took root. Though his illness never retreated, his spirit lightened. He even mustered a fragile smile when he handed Sarah the final paperwork, ensuring that Tommy and other children like him would be cared for. For the first time in a long time, the act of giving felt like real wealth, not the hollow extravagance he once prized. Sarah, for her part, remained at Linda's diner. She refused to coddle James, yet she treated him with the same kindness she offered any hungry soul. Day by day, their broken history softened into mutual understanding. No dramatic declarations, no extravagant reconciliations, just simple, human connection. And then, one day, James stopped coming. Word quietly spread that he had passed peacefully, leaving behind a legacy far different from the one he'd built in boardrooms. There was no flashy funeral or media spectacle. Only a few close acquaintances, a brief obituary, and the knowledge that in his final days he had learned the value of compassion. At the diner, Sarah's eyes glistened when she heard the news, but she carried on, serving breakfast, refilling coffee, and ensuring that Tommy never left hungry. Life goes on, she thought, heart aching yet hopeful. Because James's final gift was not just money or trust funds. It was the profound realization that the smallest acts of kindness could transform even the weariest souls. Outside, the neon sign flickered, and a new day's dawn cast golden rays across the parking lot. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and greeted the next customer with a smile. In that moment, between grief, gratitude, and the steady hum of hope, she understood that true wealth is found in every gesture of selfless love, and that was a legacy worth carrying forward. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of love to break down walls and bridge any divide. Please do comment your feedback and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of family, redemption, and the triumph of love over pride. Remember, it's never too late to change your story.